To us, it was Grand Central Station.
It can be difficult to enjoy a full night's rest growing up in a Rust Belt city without hearing the whistle of a locomotive or the screeching of boxcars moving along the railroad. The rail industry brought about change and growth to American cities. At the turn of the 20th century, Buffalo was one such city that was greatly influenced by the introduction of the railroad.
One, two, three.
The Queen City was a destination for immigrants looking to work and manufacturers because of its location on the east-west freight route between Chicago and New York City. To meet the demand for the influx of workers, travelers, and freight, Buffalo quickly became a railroad hub and required a train station to meet the increased popularity of the prospering city. Buffalo, New York had been a small outpost town on the American frontier until it was surveyed by the Holland Land Company near the turn of the 19th century. With the arrival of the Erie Canal, Buffalo became the key to any movement east or west. As the century progressed, Buffalo grew in both industry and population, eventually becoming the 8th largest city in America by the turn of the 20th century. Becoming one of the largest grain processing cities, as well as contributing to the nation's vibrant steel economy, Buffalo was on the rise and destined to become the next supercity of America because of the introduction of cheap, alternating electricity from the Niagara Falls hydroelectric plant in 1896. The city celebrated this advantage in the Pan American Exposition of 1901. As railroads replaced steamboats as the most economical way to transport goods and people, Buffalo became a pivotal spot on the rail lines because of its middle location for the expanding center of national industry. The location of Buffalo on the eastern edge of Lake Erie was, and still is, the perfect topographical location on the movement from any goods traveling east-west from New York City to Chicago and north-south from mineral-rich Pennsylvania to Canada. Traveling along the lake was much easier than traversing the Allegheny and Appalachian Mountains in the middle of the state, and Buffalo's position on Lake Erie gave the city immeasurable seafaring value to any goods traveling from the Great Lakes. Between 1865 and 1917, the national rail network grew sevenfold, from 33,085 miles of track in 1865 to 254,037 in 1917. By 1910, the city of Buffalo alone contained 660 miles of railroad track, servicing 11 different trunk lines, and was second only to Chicago among the leading railroad termini in the United States. With an increase of rail traffic around the nation, freight travel on the Erie Canal greatly diminished by 1876. In fact, railroads could transport 5 times the volume of barges on the canal. Around the nation, cities were embracing the new megalith of transportation, the railroad. In fact, the Interstate Commerce Commission reported that trains were responsible for more than 77% of intercity freight traffic and 98% of intercity passenger traffic by 1916. Passenger service on the rails grew at a slower rate than freight travel, but was steady nonetheless, growing from 5 to 35 billion passenger miles from 1865 to 1916.
Half the troubles I see is my delusion. Life is not a sweet song.
To accommodate the burgeoning industry of the railroads, the city of Buffalo needed stations that could accommodate the growing rail travel through the city of Buffalo. By 1814, the first station was erected on Exchange Street, which became the primary passenger terminal of the New York Central in Buffalo until 1929. 105 of Buffalo's 206 train movements occurred at the New York Central Exchange Street station. An article from the October 24, 1931, Buffalo Courier Express newspaper stated that during its prime, the Exchange Street station was one of the busiest places in Buffalo. The writer of the article, C.R. Davis, continued by giving a good description of the train station, illustrating the waiting room, ample amount of natural light, and the wooden benches. Davis elaborated on the surroundings of the station and described the hustle and bustle of newspaper boys, cab drivers, and even crowded side streets filled with stagecoaches. The article, Memories Rule Exchange Street, gives a solid description of the events the station lived through, such as the coming and going of President Lincoln, Mark Twain, and men off to fight in the Spanish-American War. As described in the article from the Buffalo Express, one of the main problems of the Exchange Street station was its size compared to its overwhelming use. Designed before the Civil War, the Exchange Street station needed two additions to be built, one in 1900 and the other in 1901, preceding the Pan American Exposition, to ensure Exchange Street could handle increased traffic. Another issue in Buffalo, common with other railroad hubs during the time period, was the issue of street-level smog creating from trains running along city streets. John Stiglow comments in his book, Metropolitan Corridor, that in many urban areas like Buffalo and New York City, the dense smoke created by coal-burning locomotives at street level created a dangerous environment for pedestrians crossing railroad tracks and for passengers in the suffocating train cars themselves. In addition to the smoke, 14,000 pedestrians were struck and killed by trains in 1919 alone due to poor crossing safety problems. Horses and buggies accounted for 13% of all grave collisions during the year. In fact, peddler Lorenzo Mott, walking home from work one night in 1852, was struck and killed by a train, making the headlines of the New York Times. Buffalo was no exception, and in 1888, a grade crossing commission was created by the state legislature to work in conjunction with the New York Central Railroad to eliminate the dangers and inconveniences of dangerous downtown street-level crossings in the city. The creation of this commission followed a popular trend in early 20th century America, highlighted in Mark Goldman's City on the Edge, known as the City Beautiful movement. Spurred by the Pan American Exposition, Buffalo's biggest proponent of this movement to bring order and beauty to the city was the same man who operated on President McKinley, Dr. Matthew Mann. The concerned Buffalo doctor declared a war on all things that tend to deface the beauty of Buffalo. He was particularly concerned with the railroads and the fact that they both penetrated the city and dictated land use in residential areas and by the waterfront. Mann, along with others, believed that Buffalo was becoming too suppliant towards the railroads and believed that the land consumed by the iron giants belonged to the people. This drive to beautify the city coincides with the safety issues and the need for a centralized rail station in Buffalo at the turn of the century. Carl Condit explains how New York City solved the issue of street smog by building tunnels, bridges, electrifying the locomotives, and building viaducts for the tracks. However, a more permanent solution in the form of a central station was needed. In Buffalo, that answer came in the form of discussing a Grand Central Station that would service the city's 13 rail lines. New York Central Vice President William J. Wilgus stressed the need for a new, larger station in Buffalo. Continuing to repair the increasingly insignificant Exchange Street station seemed uneconomical and unjustified to the overwhelming number of passengers. Merchants, politicians, and the Central were all on board for this proposal of a Union Station on Genesee Street, just west of Niagara Square. The city of Buffalo, however, was not. The cost of the proposed station was too much for the city, and plans were stalled, as two more additions were constructed at the Exchange Street station. Garnett Cousins sums up the situation perfectly. A joint terminal committee of the Chamber of Commerce filed a complaint with the newly formed New York State Public Service Commission, which charged New York Central with inadequate station facilities. It was evident that Buffalo required a new terminal, but politics plagued the planning process. 1 year later, talks continued between railroad executives William Wilgus, Samuel Rhee, and J. M. Graham, along with Carl Mackinder and W. H. Gratwick, who represented the interests of the city of Buffalo. A 300-acre site approximately 2.5 miles east from the city center, the site of the present-day terminal, was chosen to be the new location of a new terminal rather than the previously considered Genesee Street location. Henry Pierce, president of the International Traction Company, said in a January 1925-1906 edition of the Buffalo Courier that a Union Station on the proposed site will undoubtedly gradually change the map of Buffalo insofar as the valuation and class property is concerned. The decision of the railroads will probably please a majority of the population. Pierce's optimism was countered by Buffalo businessmen from the Central Business District who were alarmed by the plans of a terminal so far from the city center. Mayor James Adam and the city aldermen stated in the Courier that the rail corporations who were antagonizing the city of Buffalo perpetuated the discriminatory land use policy towards Buffalo. Others were alarmed by the proposed Union Station's close proximity to the Buffalo stockyards, which were located adjacent to the site by William Street and Fillmore Avenue. This delicate process of balancing politicians, businessmen, the railroads, and the cities was time-consuming. Upset by the continued stagnation of the new station headed by the New York Central Railroad in Buffalo, the Lackawanna and Lehigh Valley Railroad companies backed out of the agreement and began construction of their own city passenger stations. In 1917, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad opened a multi-level passenger terminal at the foot of Main Street, located right on the Buffalo River. This station allowed passengers to arrive by train on the upper level and walk down to the lower level to proceed to Great Lakes boat travel. The Lehigh Valley Railroad also backed out of the Union Station agreement and impatiently began construction of their own passenger terminal in 1916. It was opened for business in 1916. Perhaps upset that the two lines backed out of the plan for Buffalo's Grand Station, the city refused to give the Lehigh Road access to the rights of Scott Street. In effect, passengers had to pass under the street in a tunnel to access the terminal that faced Main Street. It was not uncommon for competing railroad giants to be uncooperative. It was no surprise that New York Central refused to be a part of the plans involving Pennsylvania Station and built their own station, Grand Central Terminal, which opened for business in 1913. As inactivity plagued the planning process of Buffalo's Union Station, the United States' entrance into World War I spelled doom for any remaining hope of the station. Following the war, however, leadership was changing in the New York Central. Patrick Crawley, a Western New York native, assumed position of the presidency of the railroad in 1924. In the 1920s, the Vanderbilt Rhodes, owning family of the New York Central, was at the height of its power and controlled the largest amount of rail lines in the nation. Many of the New York Central's building projects, such as Cincinnati and Boston stations, were constructed under Crawley's administration. Crawley and Fitzpatrick of the Joint Terminal Committee began talking and discussing options for a new Buffalo train station. After a year of negotiation, in 1925, the parties decided that the new station would be constructed on the exact spot that was discussed for the Union Station. Why the city of Buffalo and the New York Central were able to agree on the same east side location that caused such harsh backlash 2 decades before is uncertain. Perhaps the incredible need for a new terminal overpowered the opinions of Fitzpatrick and city officials who were willing to accept any leads towards a new station. Crawley voiced his logic at the Central Terminal's opening in 1929, saying, "The only satisfactory solution to the problem was to be found in the location of a station at some point along the main line, thus giving Buffalo the service and advantage of the high-class through trains, which could not make use of a station at any of the locations which had previously been discussed." This illustrates the railroad's concern for efficiency and profit as opposed to the consideration of the city and passengers. This quote, while seemingly true, can be viewed as an inaccurate political statement, as original talks for a Union Station involved the location at the foot of Main Street, right in the center of the city. However, the east side of Buffalo was easier for New York Central trains bypassing Buffalo en route to New York City or Chicago. If a train were to enter the city of Buffalo, it would have to navigate near the Buffalo River and the coast of Lake Erie. This was incredibly dangerous for locomotives during inclement weather, and even high speeds, as they can very easily misjudge a turn and end up in the water. Along with the hazard of the water, the east side was far enough from city streets to eliminate traversing pedestrian roads with heavy freight. The east side location was chosen to make train travel through the city of Buffalo much more efficient. Regardless of the moral standpoint on the decision, plans were set in motion to construct the Buffalo Central Terminal in 1926. Terminals were constructed to combine different rail lines in one location and to centralize the city's rail movement. In some cities like Buffalo, with more than one train station servicing different lines, it was not uncommon to have a transfer between trains and stations that would be miles apart. St. Louis and later Cincinnati joined the terminal movement as their stations were built to service 13 trunk lines. John Stilgoe noted that urban congestion plagued early urban reformers at the turn of the century, and the way to get rid of disorganization was through the well-regulated railroads, who shaved time and created steady flows of traffic through the use of terminals. The only thing standing in the way of constructing the Buffalo Central Terminal was the need to purchase 150 home sites from the Polish-speaking community to make room. William S. Rand, legal representative for the New York Central, handled this affair and completed the task by April of 1926. The New York Central continued to work with the city of Buffalo to move Curtis Street 200 feet. The railroad company also needed to widen Petorovsky and Lovejoy streets to accommodate the increased traffic that would enter and depart from Buffalo. Construction was finally completed 3 years after it began, on June 22, 1929, the eve of the Great Depression. With such a monumental building being opened in the city, a grand ceremony was planned involving 2,000 local and railroad officials, citizens, and business owners. This large crowd introduced the new $14 million station of the city of Buffalo and the New York Central just 5 months before the great stock market crash. Railroad stations like the Buffalo Central Terminal were both an expression of big business and an expression of art. Completed in 1929, Buffalo Central Terminal was an architectural Art Deco masterpiece and exemplified the city's and railroad's industrial power. In fact, visitor Clyde Patterson remembers,
"The high vaulted ceilings and marble floors were a testament to the power of the New York Central."
Praised by Buffalo citizen Ottilia Torek, who had used the terminal many times between 1935 and 1950, as one of the most magnificent buildings she had ever seen. The terminal solved railroad efficiency issues experienced by numerous smaller stations in the city, as well as displayed modern art on a grand scale. The terminal contained ornamental metal finials in fleur-de-lis patterns, carved marble reminiscent of papyrus leaves, lights faceted like crystals, as concerned with geometry as illumination. The high-arched tiled ceilings became one with the wall. A woman's room patterned after the most opulent theaters. Decorative patterns done in a Native American-like pattern of red, gold, green, black, and gray. Across the passenger concourse and opposite the waiting room was a 100-foot, 10-foot long, 56-foot deep combination coffee shop, lunchroom, dining room, restaurant, seating 250 persons.
It was the grandest building I've ever seen.
Similar to Buffalo City Hall, geometric, ornate Native American references were present in the terminal. A large mural of the history of the Buffalo-Niagara region was also present in the main concourse, along with a clock, ticket offices, a jeweler, and the famed stuffed buffalo. The tower, jutting out from the station 15 stories into the air, was modeled after Romanesque churches, with the spire becoming the clock tower. Fellheimer modified the large semicircular window arches installed in the main building by framing them with square-topped, buttress-like matzes. While demonstrating the art of the city of Buffalo and the power of the New York Central, the massive building also showcased the efficiency of the railroad. This newer station mimicked the design of Fellheimer's mentor Charles Reade's Grand Central Station in New York City. Both New York Central Railroad stations included a revolutionary two-level scheme, one level for the main floor and the lower level a track level for incoming and departing trains. Large ramps connected the two levels of the Buffalo Central Terminal, and the same bold design would be copied in the later Cincinnati Union Terminal, as well as the Kansas City Union Station. The enormous ramps at Buffalo were allotted to the arriving passengers. Fellheimer would provide ramps for both arriving and departing passengers at the later Cincinnati station. The Buffalo Central Terminal had 14 passenger tracks with provision for 10 more if needed. To put it in perspective, Pennsylvania Station in New York City could account for 118,000 passengers per weekday. Buffalo Central Terminal could accommodate 76,000 passengers a day, and the Jersey City Terminal could only handle a meager 39,000 passengers per weekday. In the passenger concourse, a singular four-sided clock is the only thing present in the middle of the floor plan, next to the information booth. Nearly every train station had a clearly visible clock inside its walls. Grand Central Station's clock and Buffalo Central Terminal clock looked very similar. Clocks illustrated the punctuality of the railroad company, as well as giving travelers an idea of what time it was and how long they had to wait or rush to catch their train. The clock was also a popular meeting place, as it was usually the only thing standing in the middle of the floor plan of an open passenger concourse, with the exception of maybe a water fountain. Phrases like, "meet me under the clock," became common language for lovers traveling on the railroad. The clock was not the only part of the train station that impacted the social life of passengers. Also located in the passenger concourse was a taxidermy buffalo. Not just any animal, this buffalo represented the city of its namesake, strong, humble, and caring. Later replaced by a bronze statue, the buffalo is the focus of countless stories told by city residents who lived in Buffalo during World War II. Otilia Torek can vividly remember sending her brother off to war and telling him to meet her back at the buffalo upon his return, and how others would take hair from the buffalo burst for good luck. The Toreks were united at war's end, but unfortunately that is not the case for others who shared similar experiences sending loved ones away. Oftentimes, the Buffalo Central Terminal was the last contact individuals had with loved ones before sending them off to war, never to return. The emotional connection found amongst these people and the train station is amazing. Unfortunately, due to increased competition from federally subsidized modes of transportation, like the airplane and the automobile, rail usage across the nation steadily declined following the end of World War II. Buffalo Central Terminal experienced a similar decline in rail traffic during the post-World War II era. Its location, 2.5 miles from the city center, certainly did not help its cause. After the New York Central merger with Penn Central in 1968, and eventually with Amtrak in 1971, the Buffalo Terminal went up for auction in 1979. Although the city of Buffalo is currently focusing on the reuse and preservation of downtown buildings like the Larkin Office Square, as well as the Statler Hotel, the terminal's location on the east side makes it difficult for preservationists in downtown Buffalo to consider the site in their efforts to create a renaissance in Buffalo. There is a dilemma concerning the problem of who could use such a massive space while being economical, and how such a massive space could be used to maximize monetary output. However, hope still remains, as the restoration organization, along with the help of a great volunteer force, continues to slowly but surely restore the terminal and replace items that have been stolen from the building, such as the clock, during its 40 years of neglect. Buffalo Central Terminal is a train station that has long been neglected in the physical sense and in the historical community. This lesser-known train station shares striking characteristics with other more notable terminals across the country, like New York's Grand Central Station, Pennsylvania Station, and Cincinnati Union Terminal, to name a few. As slow progress continues to plague preservation of the site on the east side, hope remains for Buffalo Central Terminal and other stations. Pittsburgh and Cincinnati have been repurposed for contemporary use, turning their stations into shopping malls and restaurants. With its darkest days in the recent past, both the city of Buffalo and its Central Terminal look toward a brighter future where the city of Buffalo returns to its former glory.
But oh, that war has made me blue. I like fighting, that's my name. But fighting am the least about the fighting game. When Mr. Hoover said to cut my dinner down.